Terrific. Thanks, Bruce. And thanks for having us. We are delighted to be here today. I'm delighted to be joined by this panel. I did indeed propose this topic to Bruce. I didn't know I would then get to be the moderator of the topic, but I'm very happy to do that and work closely, certainly with Evan and Kelly. I know Greg does as well. Really, Evan and Kelly, two of the leaders in this space, and we'll talk about why it's so important to have specific cyber crisis comm specialists. But the topic, I think, is so critical because, in tabletops, we might start with a slow escalation to test out that escalation scheme. And so it's not critical to immediately think about crisis comms. And even in real incidents, even when it goes boom by having an internal note from a threat actor saying, hey, we've got your stuff, you've been encrypted, and if you don't pay us, it will go public, but it hasn't gone public. So sometimes there it's slow. But in one of our incidents this year, our client found out about the incident because they missed the internal note. The threat actor posted their stuff online. A plaintiff's attorney found it and sued our client, and that's how our client found out about the breach. So very much public early on. And I think that even when it is the slow burn, it is the crisis communications that takes over as the leading work stream after day 2 or 3, once we've got our arms a little bit triage level. And so why certainly this topic is so timely and such a huge part of incident response. With Bruce giving us amazing introductions, I think we'll jump right into it. And I want to start from the worst case scenarios. Evan, maybe I start with you. Lightning round for each of you guys. Evan, Kelly, Greg, biggest communication mistakes that you see in incident response?
Yeah, I mean, I'll pick one that I see, and fortunately, I think in a lot of cases we're able to rein in, but an instinct that is there for a lot of clients, which is using comms to publicly fight a threat actor and stick the thumb in the eye and using terms like terrorism and an attack on American sovereignty and this, that, and the other, and taking something out of that realm of just financially motivated criminality and making it a much bigger deal. So from CEOs on down, I get the instinct, but that's one of the fastest ways to turn up the temperature, particularly when the threat actors are reading your comms and picking them apart.
Kelly, how about you?
I would say over-promising on what's known at the time, saying, oh, the data, this data wasn't impacted, or this system, we're totally fine. It's over-promising on, this is nothing to see here. And then, the threat actors usually say, oh, really, you didn't think that data was impacted? Well, here you go. So just really making overbroad statements that they can't back up with an investigation just yet.
Oh, yeah, there was a law firm that did that a few years ago. They said our data wasn't impacted. The threat actor went to town on the website saying, oh, really? Your data's not impacted? Here and here and here. It's crazy. Greg, what do you think?
Yeah, I think both of those mistakes, and I'm happy to say they aren't mistakes that clients I've been guiding have made, but I've seen others make, are really generated by a rush to fill the silence. You got to remember that silence is temporary. It only acts for a little while and it creates a little bit of a discomfort. But if you could get past the discomfort to a point where you make a meaningful statement at a point in time when you really know enough to make a statement, you're in much better shape, because that silence and the discomfort, nobody remembers it, but they will remember forever an inaccurate statement. And because I spend so much of the time of litigating cases, I think about the Miranda warning around communications, which is whatever you say can and will be used against you. So you have to think about it in terms of how will this look in a courtroom 2 years from now? And if you take that longer lens, you're going to make better choices. And a measured statement in 36 hours is much better than a rushed statement in 6 hours.
Great point. And I think maybe combining some of those in terms of the promises about what our data is and then the rush to fill the silence. The promise of an update, right? We saw some companies come out and say, we're going to provide updates every 4 hours. And I just don't know of an investigation that has something to add every 4 hours. So coming out and saying that is very dangerous, because you're looking to be transparent, but you just can't deliver. And when your 4-hour update is, I have nothing more to add, it leads to frustration instead of happiness about transparency. But we'll come back certainly to that question of transparency versus waiting a little bit. Greg, that's a great point. Greg, maybe I stay with you to start this next one. What do you think about a communications playbook, right? If we start before incidents and we think through that as for our first couple questions here, how do you think of working with clients with a communications playbook ahead of anything going south on us?
Yeah, I think the most important thing that clients can do by way of a playbook is to establish a process by which communications will be developed. And let's be candid here. Most of us and most of you attendees are legal and compliance professionals. We have colleagues in our PR and communications departments. They're advised by folks like Kelly and Evan, and there could be some tension between those two groups. The communications teams really want to get out ahead of the narrative. They want to say something. They want to fill that silence. They want to say something now. They want to say something with details, and they want to have a human, empathetic voice. Legal tends to say, no, let's wait for verified facts. Let's provide precise language, and let's make sure we limit over disclosure and the future legal risk. There's a tension there. But the thing I encourage clients to do is use that tension for good. Use the power of that to come out in a better place. And if you design a process ahead of time where you're going to necessarily make sure that you're collaborating between those two groups and coming to a balance between those two places, you're going to end up in a better spot. So if your process says we're going to develop communications by starting with a template that we've all agreed ahead of time is like a holding statement, something that in different scenarios we're going to use, and then saying, here's how we're going to revise it. Communications will take a first shot, and then legal will look at it, and then we'll all harmonize it together, or whatever is going to work for your organization, but making sure that you allow all of those voices to be heard so you come out with the best possible final work product.
Great. And so that process often is in a pre-comms playbook. Kelly, I'm going to come to you with this one. If we are thinking of that, I've seen these in all different types and sizes, right? A 3-page with 3 main pre-comms, and I have seen a 70-page comms playbook, which I like that you're laughing because I know this is in your business life. I don't think anybody would ever open that, and that's just a ton of work. What's your thoughts, Kelly? I mean, you laughed at 70. Thank you, by the way. What do you do with clients in terms of a pre-comms playbook?
I'm not laughing at it. I'm laughing with it because I do have a client who I think it's up to 80 pages now. But we have multiple scenarios. I think it's important. I think the most important thing about the playbook is that people are familiar with it. And so if it's an 80-page book and that's not part of your company's culture to pull out an 80-page book, then it's not helpful. But if it is part of your company's culture to be like, we know the scenarios, we know where it is, then it's a helpful tool. You've got to make it helpful to where you're at. I think it should have, as Greg said, it should have a list of like the working group, who really needs to be in the room about talking about comms, because everyone is a communications expert at some point in these incidents, and who really needs to be in the room. It's a mix of usually the investigation team, legal, of course, and compliance, communications, and some executive representation. And then we like to have a little bit of like, what are the possible scenarios? And, today we're talking about ransomware, and that definitely should be in there because there's going to be maybe outages. There's definitely going to be a threat actor making accusations, but then you will also have other scenarios that are important to the company, whether it's, just a standard data breach, or if it's actually just an outage that's actually not cyber impacted. So making sure that, this playbook is helpful for, it marries up to the incident response plan that the company has. And then I also think a little bit of an audience chart with the channels you use to communicate with them, because you have to remember that you have to think about, who do we need to communicate an incident? And is it, our customers? Well, do you have it broken down by VIP customers and standard customers? And how are the tools that you use? Noting that in a ransomware, you may not have all those, channels at your disposal. Maybe your website is down, or maybe you can't get to Salesforce to send a message. So thinking through the options that you have to communicate, and even being ready to list just a plain old phone call, that having your sales team make calls. Really thinking through all the tools that you can use to communicate with those groups, and just so when you're in an incident, you can have somewhat of a start of a roadmap of how we would communicate about it.
I love it. I love it. And you're absolutely right. I think a 70-page is way too long and no one's going to use it. But the building of it may exactly have been what builds that muscle memory. And we'll come back to you, Kelly, to talk about how do we test all that. But I wanted to give Evan a chance. Evan, what are your thoughts on plans and as we work on developing them?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything that's been said, and I think to the point you were just making, Erez, like a lot of the development of a plan, whether it's 20 pages or 80 pages, and I'm kind of with you, I think between 15 and 25 is kind of your sweet spot. A lot of it is the journey rather than the destination of forcing people to have conversations that are very difficult to have in a live incident outside of a live incident. I always use this example, but I was doing a tabletop for a company. It was just their comms team. And of the 90 minutes we had booked, we spent 45 talking about whether we were going to use the word ransomware in a statement. And that's not 45 minutes you have in a live incident. So at the very least, while it wasn't the most productive tabletop I've ever been a part of, at least they hashed it out there. But I think the one element that is often overlooked in these plans, everybody is kind of oriented around how do comms get developed and pushed out. I think where sometimes the gap is, how do we take them in, right? Because particularly if you're in a B2B situation, your sales force is, to Kelly's point, making phone calls or sending emails. But then you've got someone who's used to selling widgets on a day-to-day basis, getting a 45-question security questionnaire from, a large financial institution. Where does that go? How does it get from that group to the group that's going to be tracking, triaging, drafting responses, and pushing it back out? So I also think part of the sort of what good looks like in that planning process is building a loop rather than just avenues to get comms out. How do we also intake comms from our partners, vendors, customers? Who's going to blacklist our IP? Who's going to start blocking our emails? What do we do with that? Who's making that phone call to reestablish that connection? I think having it essentially building a machine that can run on a repeatable basis is one of the best ways to minimize business interruption, encryption aside. And I think that's one place where organizations often can get themselves tripped up because it just becomes chaos when the incoming is coming from all angles.
Right. Great points. I like your mention of the term, should we use the word ransomware? That's going to be in incident, so I'll leave that, but I have follow-ups for all of you all. Should we use that word? Should it be cyber incident? So think about that while we finish the kind of the pre-phase. Kelly, I'm coming back to you on the pre-phase. So we're working on all these, some really great points. How long is the plan? Having samples, thinking through main scenarios. How are we going to communicate? This historically device of actually picking up a phone. I don't know if the young people even know that there's you can talk on those devices. They're just for texting. But how do we work on those? How do you build that muscle memory, Kelly? Like, we've got these great elements, but how do we then get people to know about this?
Tabletops, I think, or simulations, depends on what generation you're from to what you call them. But I think getting people together in a room at least once a year and having, ideally an organization like mine or Evan's or Greg's or yours, Erez, and putting together a simulation where not only does the tech team get quizzed and they test the incident response plan and whatever, but the organization itself gets tested on how would you communicate about this and taking them through scenarios. Okay, what do you do? And then, this happens, then what would you do? And that, my best, tabletops are when the client actually says, oh, here's our plan on page, step 7 is this, or even if they don't have the steps memorized, but they're actually using it and they have the right people in the room and they're building a collaborative muscle memory, and legal and comms are coordinating just in the simulation. So that way, in the event of an incident, it's not foreign or it's like, oh, wait, what do we do? Who do we need to hear? It's just a good way just to practice that. And they really do help, brush off the plan and sometimes find holes in it where, wait, we didn't account for X, Y, Z.
Yeah, I love tabletops, and I've had the privilege of having our team and your team, Kelly, recently do one focused on comms. And just a month before that, we did one with Evan focused on comms. It's rare, I know, because of budgets, to bring in 2 consultants. But if one's leading and the other is really coming for the tabletop, I think it can be not a huge extra lift and gives a lot of value to have both teams. Greg, we talked about this, and you had a great point about tabletops, I think worth sharing with the team here. What are your thoughts on how to really make those work?
Yeah, I think from a communications perspective, you need to be sure that during the tabletop, you're actually developing the communication, because far too often I see tabletops as presenting, here's the incoming. Either it's an incoming inquiry or a media reporter has reached out or something else, and they say, okay, would we respond to this? And people kind of say, yeah, I guess, maybe. But you actually want to develop it. And I'll acknowledge that it's really hard in a tabletop to draft. You're not going to sit there and type out, here's what our press release is going to say. But one thing I saw a provider do recently that was pretty good was gave some multiple choices, said, here's 4 different things the company could do. Statement A, B, C, or D say nothing. And then let people in the room pick which one they're going to go with. And then kind of like a choose your own adventure book, kind of show what happens if you pick A, B, C, or D and play out those scenarios. I thought that was pretty good. The other thing that I think is really helpful, and tabletops are great, but an addition to that is practicing on little incidents, little scenarios. Every single organization that we all represent and work with has little incidents all the time, almost weekly, certainly monthly. Something comes really close to being an incident. It gets to the 3rd level of defense before that level of defense prevents the thing from being an incident. Take that, get your incident response team together and say, okay, if this had turned into an actual incident, if that final layer of defense had failed and we had an actual incident, what would we have done? And then you have a much more realistic scenario than your tabletop would have been, and you have a little bit more time to then prepare pretend communications. And maybe you never use them because in that incident, that final level of defense stopped it from becoming a thing that required communication. But real live facts make better than any fiction we could ever create.
I love it. So actually testing with real scenarios, or this is what I love, and also in board briefings and others, but how would you have handled some major crisis that another company is going through? So never let a crisis go to waste, really. Evan, any other thoughts on the best ways we can really get those plans, 10, 15, 80 pages, actually kind of up here?
Yeah, I think the one thing, and I'm going to steal this term that actually comes from our own risk and compliance officer, because we've been in the exercise of updating FTI's cyber comms plan, which is before the tabletop, doing a table read. And I think what often happens with tabletops, or what can happen with tabletops, I should say, is some group over here wrote a plan and a bunch of people have a role to play in it, but they've never really read it. And then they get thrown into a tabletop exercise and everybody's afraid to make a mistake, and it kind of creates analysis paralysis. I like before that point to get everybody in a conference room, get the plan up on a big screen, and do a low pressure walkthrough of, yeah, we'll have comms people in there, but bring legal, bring InfoSec, bring compliance, and say, does this all make sense to everybody? Does this follow what's kind of in your head as normal practice? And give people like that lower pressure, there are no wrong answers, discussion-based exercise before you say, here's your fake ransom note and your company's encrypted and how are you going to deal with it? And then you've got sort of that competing, I don't want to look bad in front of everybody else. So I like to sort of ease your way into the practice scenarios by just investing the time to make sure everybody is really familiar with the plan, and you don't find yourself in that tabletop where someone throws up a hand and says that could never happen, because I think we've all been there and that could just derail the exercise from the jump.
I love it. Really, I call those walkthroughs as opposed to tabletops, really taking them through that. And in the walkthroughs, I think you actually look at the IR plan. It's amazing to me how many incidents I work in which the comms plan is never opened. The IR plan is never opened. Frankly, I open it because I'm like, okay, look, if a litigation happens, they're going to look through your plan. You should look through it too to make sure you've checked those boxes. I don't think that's a sign of bad things. Companies have practiced them. I don't look through my fire plan when I walk out during a fire drill, right? It's all up here. But I do think we need to because of litigation. And I want to turn now from this to actual incident response. By the way, we have 2 questions, a little bit about cadence of communications. We'll get to those. So for those who've asked those, thank you. For those who might have questions, please feed them in. We'll try to get to them. Greg, I want to start with you on this one because it is usually the lawyer coming in before the crisis comms firm. What are the first 24 hours of ransomware response looking like from a communications perspective?
Yeah, but frankly, in the first 24 hours, you don't know much. I'm a big proponent of what I actually call the 24-hour rule, which is no fact is true until it's been thought about and publicized and emerged for at least 24 hours. And I have to cite the general counsel of Home Depot, who, after the Home Depot incident, was very public about saying that was a rule that they applied, that once you thought, this is maybe what happened, you don't treat that as true for at least 24 hours. And that's because IT and forensic folks are scientists and technologists. And so they're very good at what they do. But the way they approach a problem is they come up with a theory. They say, I know these little pieces of information, and I'm going to come up with a theory of how those fit together. And then I'm going to go test the theory. And sometimes they'll come into an incident response meeting and they'll say, here's our working theory. And then they go test it. And unfortunately, sometimes the incident response team hears that theory and says, well, my IT people are really smart. And here's what they think. So that must be true. And that's not the case at all. They're still off testing that. So you want to make sure that you're not doing anything that relies on that information until you've tested that theory. But, and sometimes as compliance and legal professionals, it's our job to get them to pump the brakes a little bit. Say, let's just wait until we know for sure. But while you're waiting, that's the time to make sure you do engage a crisis communication professional like Evan or Kelly or their firms, and someone who is a specialist in incident response, because crisis communications, very broad field, lots of people do lots of different kinds of things. The incident response flavor of it has really become a niche specialty. And if you're not being served by someone who acts in that specialty all the time and has been there before a lot, you're doing yourself a disservice. So make sure that long before, as Erez says, that the house is on fire, long before you have an incident, you know who you're going to as a crisis communication specialist in the incident response space.
I can't agree with you more, Greg, especially on that. I think we look at Evan and Kelly here, and I say this to my clients. I cite Evan and Kelly in those meetings too, not just because they happen to be on this panel. And there are a few others, and that's about it. I do not cite 100 firms, and I don't cite all the PR firms. And one of my biggest fights with clients is don't let your comms team just use their regular PR firm. There is a value in the amount of work that Evan and Kelly and their respective firms, and as I said, just a small handful of others can bring to the table from that experience and the mistakes, frankly, that have been made in communications, and can learn from them. And so, honestly, sometimes my clients will tell me, well, our comms team won't bring in the cyber specialist. So why don't you just handle comms? You have known this for a long time. And while I think I do know a lot of this, I actually have higher rates, and it's Evan and Kelly's literally their job to do this. And so I don't understand it, but highly recommend it. Evan, let me start with you on this question. You aren't always there in the first 24 hours because we're fighting to get you to be brought in, or we're dealing with the triage of the incident response. If you could get there for the first 24 hours, what would your first 24 hours look like in terms of counseling on let's start thinking, because we're hopefully not doing comms yet in 24 hours, as Greg said.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to the original, like, which path are we going to go down question to me is, and I know we're talking about ransomware, which is very specific, it involves the where, but if I can expand it a little bit to involve all data extortion and data theft types of incidents. Is there encryption? And if so, how obvious is that to internal or external stakeholders? Because that's the one place where I find you may have to do something in the first 24 hours, because if it is very obvious to employees of the company, or even more importantly, customers, consumers, business partners, that something is broken and not working the way it should, I think the tolerance for we're having an IT issue that is then going to evolve into a cybersecurity issue that then may evolve into a ransomware issue, and I'm not trying to jump ahead in the agenda here, Erez, I think the tolerance for that is a lot lower. I can tell you from the media, it's definitely a lot lower, and they love dunking on companies that stick with IT outage for 3, 4, 5 days and then evolve it into, actually, Joe didn't spill coffee on a server, it's a security incident. But if that's not the case, then if you've got a little bit of time to establish your facts, I completely agree with Greg. Even the companies that want to be uber transparent, and I totally get that, still take the time to understand what happened, at least directionally, to try to put some four walls around what you're going to be communicating. So if everything's down and a company's dead in the water, you may need to push comms in that first 24 hours. But otherwise, I'm using that time to spend with you, or someone like you, Erez, to spend with information security, to hopefully have a full call that has all of the advisors involved, so I can absorb what the forensic firm is saying and sort of use that to start shaping a comms strategy so I can absorb what the company leadership is saying about, sort of to Kelly's point about the plans, like, here are the 5 customers we really need to be thinking about. They're going to have a very low tolerance for us sitting on this for 3 months while we do e-discovery, and using that to help shape the strategy. So really, it's, is it broken or is it not? Otherwise, integrate with the team and don't let comms just be sitting off in the hallway waiting for something to be slipped under the conference room door.
I love it. I really do. I get asked the question all the time. We're not ready for comms yet. Why do we need to hire them yet? Can't we just bring them on later? And I love this point about, well, wouldn't it be great if they had the context that we might forget to give them, even though we're trying to? Wouldn't it be great if they learned that to help shape your narrative even better? Kelly, Evans now brought this up, so I'm going to give you the first dip, and I'm going to use Greg's great options point. You have a ransomware incident. It's caused you an outage and data theft. You know all those. For some reason, you're communicating. Are we using ransomware? Cyber incident? Cyber event? IT outage? Where do you fall in these? And Evan and Greg, I'm coming to you next, so you got to pick one too. Go ahead, Kelly.
I think it's like, like Evan said, it's gathering context. And I would say, if we know, I'd be asking, well, what do we think the data is impacted, and who would eventually we need to notify? What are going to be the legal requirements, especially with state notices, and, just picking apart how much are we going to have to say publicly in like regulatory letters that is going to come that we need to match up to now. And I can see in the early stages saying, we're having an IT issue. And then as you know more, like something like where you said, you have an outage, you have data theft. I could see leaning into a cyber incident. I don't have a lot of clients say ransomware just because the follow-up question is, what's the ransom? Are you going to pay? And
right.
Those are 2 uncomfortable questions that we have very sophisticated, drafted, benign answers to, but I just think we try to avoid.
Great. Greg, ransomware, cyber incident, IT outage, where do you lean?
Yeah, I stick with incident. I think when you use the word ransom or ransomware or anything else like it, it creates a sensationalism to things that is unhelpful, both in terms of how big the story is going to become, which generally you don't want the story to become big, and also in terms of the likelihood you're going to get litigation and how that litigation is going to be framed. So from that litigation perspective and the PR perspective, I think you want to stay away from sensationalizing, which includes ransom. And it also includes, do you answer what's the name of the threat actor, which is the other kind of question that gets popped around is, am I going to say that this was Soda no Kibi or R Evil or Scattered Spider or, any of those other names that have such a great brand to them that they naturally make a story pop, and so that's why I tend to stay away from anything that makes the story sexier than we want it to be.
Yeah, especially early on. Evan, you teed this up, so cyber incident as well?
I'm going to assume a position that is very comfortable for me, which is being a little bit contrarian. I often actually do advise my clients to strongly consider using the term ransomware. And let me tell you why. Because I don't disagree with anything that Kelly or Greg said. I think a couple of things are true. Unless a payment's going to be made, everyone's going to know it's ransomware eventually because you're going to get posted and named and shamed, assuming there's data exfiltration. And I think that ransomware, perhaps to the general public, is a sensationalized term. For the business community, it is an everyday occurrence. And so I agree that there's risk associated, but I tend to think that you get some credibility. Again, I'm thinking more of that B2B audience rather than B2C audience. You get some credibility with just saying what it is and saying it in a way that conveys that you're not panicked by the fact that you're having a ransomware attack, because ransomware attacks, unfortunately, are a dime a dozen. So it's not appropriate in every scenario, but I do oftentimes think that we're experiencing a cybersecurity incident. We've determined this as a result of ransomware. Particularly, again, if you're in that B2B audience, we all know it. They're going to get security questionnaires. They're going to ask that specific question. They're going to ask to name the threat actor. They're going to ask for the strain of malware. And if they get that questionnaire 15 days after an incident and you've now said, yes, it was ransomware, and yes, it was scattered spider, and then you've got teams looking back and saying, why did you tell me you had a technology outage 12 days ago? Did you not know at the time that it was ransomware? So I tend to think that there's almost a credibility aspect to saying it. I know I'm being a little bit of a maverick here, but I'm comfortable with that. As I said, not every circumstance, but I think there's a lot of times where it is appropriate just to say, yeah, that's what it is, and we're dealing with it.
Erez, turnaround's fair play. What's your answer to the question?
Well, I would
ransomware?
probably start. No, I would start with cyber incident. I'm not working with Evan again anymore.
Great.
Healthy tension. Remember, this is where we use that.
I would probably start with cyber incident, but you know what? I like how Evan struck a difference between B2B and B2C. Great point there. In a B2C, in a B2B, maybe, but certainly I would have a response. And I know Evan and Kelly do this, both of them. When pressed, right, in our FAQ, it goes, when pressed, yes, it's ransomware. When pressed, fine, I'll give you IOCs, and I'll certainly tell you it's Akira or whoever when pressed. But I try not to do those because also early on, we actually don't know. We have an incident right now. We actually don't know. We had the data theft. It's unclear if it's ransomware. And ransomware technically is you have ransomed my with a software, right? There's malware. Most of the stuff now is data theft. So it's really not ransomware. It's encryption or it's data theft, extortion, as opposed to ransomware. So,
which is, and just to grab onto that really quickly, Erez, the flip side of what I said is if it is data theft and extortion and there is no where, I advise hard going into this was not ransomware and not letting people conflate, well, there's a ransom or extortion involved. Yeah, but there's no where. And that's important. That's very important for how business partners are going to react. So I do think there is a strong distinction. I don't like to use it as a blanket term for any type of extortion. But if it is, we're down and it's because of encryption malware. As I said, I'm out on a limb a little bit, but I don't mind being there. I tend to think it can be helpful.
Evan, let me stay with you because you're clearly leaning into some transparency, and we've got a question we want to talk about with transparency. It's I think back and forth we go in the yearly kind of attitudes. Do we come out early on? Do we identify this from the beginning? Do we try to press in or do we not, right? In recent incidents, there were, with a lot of companies hit, some companies came out early and talked about their breaches. Others said, I'm waiting until I get my arms around it and I can share more facts. Where is the kind of prevailing attitude today? Evan, we'll start with you on this one.
Yeah, I think what's important to think about, and I'm going to give a measured answer here, which probably goes to what I often advise, which is measured transparency, which is I don't think there's any value in an early disclosure if you can't tell your stakeholders anything that is important or helpful to them. So as I said sort of a few minutes ago, if your company is not operational or a large part of it's not operational and people can tell, you don't really have a choice. You got to say something's going on. I think pretending that it's not or saying that it's related to some sort of technology outage, I really don't like that. But otherwise, I think if you're dealing with, let's say, Erez, data theft and extortion, and you are at least in negotiations with a threat actor, whether or not you're going to reach some sort of settlement, I do think it is appropriate to take the time to understand at least enough so that a disclosure, whether it's official or unofficial, is helpful to the person that you're speaking to. And I also think it's important to put yourselves in the shoes of the person that you're going to be speaking to, particularly if that person is a security professional at a customer, and think about what facts can you give them that will reassure them or give them a sense that they're not at risk. So the fact pattern, I think, is really important. If it's, let's say, like a CLOP situation where there's no encryption, everybody knows they don't do that, I think it's appropriate to take a little bit more time to understand, even if you're not going to do a full sort of e-discovery, PII identification approach, at least have some understanding of what happened before you go shout from the rooftops that you've had an incident. And I think that really sort of the forensic facts can be really helpful there. If it's like a single user got phished and they got into a file share and they stole some stuff and there was no lateral movement and there was no malware, well, yeah, of course, then you take the time to understand what data was taken because you're not helping anybody by just saying that happened. So I really think letting the facts of what actually happened in the incident guide how early and often you communicate, I think is really important. And so that's the way I tend to think about it, rather than taking we're going to be transparent about every single incident we have, no matter what, because that's who we are as a company. I think sometimes that can do more harm than good.
Yeah. Yeah, Kelly, we recently did a tabletop in which the executive said, let's be as transparent as humanly imaginable. The next day they were hit by an incident and they said, well, let's actually get our arms around the facts, which I think was the right call. Let's get our arms around it so we can tell something helpful. Where do you lean, Kelly, in terms of that? Are you with Evan, or I've seen it go both ways. I had a client go full on immediately and they got a lot of props for it. And others, I've had a third party tell one of my clients, well, you told me early, you didn't give me any facts. All you did is put me in a bad situation. That's not really helpful. I wish you didn't tell me. What do you think, Kelly? And then Greg, I'd love to hear from you on the legal aspects of that.
Yeah, I lean close to Evan that, you really need to let, what is the situation? What do we know so far and what information was impacted to how much we need to put out, early. But then the second, thing I always think about is what is the company's culture? And if I know a lot in tech like to be very transparent early on. And if that is their organization, I want clients to stay close to their culture. And I try to prepare them that it's going to be a frustrating road. If you don't have all the information, you're going to, have these difficult conversations. You're going to get asked questions where you're not going to know the answer. If you want to lean into that transparency, it's going to be a little challenging to have those conversations at first. But they want to remain core to their culture of, we're going to, tell what we know. So.
Yeah. Greg, conflict in the legal position on this, right? Like, hey, I want to go out early. Are there legal issues you're thinking about with that?
Yeah, for sure. And they all come from the follow-up questions. You think you're doing something great for your customers or other stakeholders by going out early and saying, we've had an incident, and you think that that's pro-customer. But then when they come with the follow-up questions, like what happened? Well, we don't know. When are you going to fix it? We don't know. Was my information impacted? We don't know. Are there going to be notification obligations here? We don't know. If you answer all those follow-up questions or you're unable to answer all those follow-up questions, you're better off waiting, because from a legal perspective, you risk triggering a notification obligation for your customer if you're holding data that would trigger notification requirements and you tell the customer, hey, we've had an incident. The customer now says, well, gee, maybe social security numbers were involved. Maybe they were compromised, but we don't know. You've kind of now put them in a position where they know enough that maybe they're on a clock for a notification obligation, but they don't know enough to actually do anything about it. So when you think you're doing them a favor, you've really put them in a really compromised position.
Yeah, who would think that? And it's really a catch-22 sometimes, right? You tell them too late, then they say, why didn't you abide by our most ignored contractual provision among any contractual provisions, right? That notification window. And you tell them early, you don't have information. They're yelling at you for not giving them updates like you promised. Kelly, I want to start with you on the next one. And I know we're short on time, but we did get some questions. What about the order of communications? There's so many stakeholders. There might be regulators, there might be the FBI, there are clients, there are VIP clients, there's internal comms. How do we deal with this ordering situation?
We would help clients with what we call, it's an old-fashioned rollout, and it's a TikTok of here's how we're going to roll out the communications. And it's taking into account that, okay, if we are going to go proactive about this, thinking back through, okay, do we need to arm the sales force with keep talking points to talk to their clients? Do we need to do a training? So it's thinking, how is the circle expanding? So getting, usually your employees or those key teams that are going to be talking to customers looped in and trained and ready to have a lot of times the difficult conversations we just talked about. Then it's expanding, then we go to our customers. And then making sure, those at the same time as we're going to customers, we might be going to regulators, working with legal team to advise when do those conversations need to happen. And then just expanding outward. Then we go to, maybe a mass notification. We put up a blog post, just keep it expanding the circle, making sure that we're getting to those key stakeholders, making, as we've already mapped out for, who are the most important ones we need to get to first, and then working our way outward.
Yeah, I love that kind of ordering, and it's such an important one. So laying that out, that's what the plans are really great for, and thinking through strategy around that. Greg, we talked about in our prep call about some of the considerations that you think about in ordering, and I wanted to give you a minute to talk about that. I know we're starting to run low on time.
Sure. And I think you said it right, Erez, that at the beginning of an incident, it starts out and day one, it's an IT issue. And maybe day 2 or 3, it becomes a communications issue. But in the life of an incident, months later and years later, it's going to be a legal issue. And I frequently say to in-house lawyers, in that crisis moment, the first week or the first month, everybody's paying attention to this. Months from now, years from now, we lawyers will be the only one who even remember that this happened and are still dealing with it. So recognize that in those early communications, you can reduce a lot of risk with really good communications. You could create a lot of risk with bad communications. So think about that for the long term.
Great. Evan, I want to start this question with you. We talked this on prep. I don't know where we all came to this, but nobody really likes to say whether you've made a ransom payment, even if you did. You talked about actually admitting ransomware. What are your thoughts? Do we say everywhere, yes, we made it, or standard practice seems to be no?
Yeah, so I would say I rarely, there are exceptions to every rule. I could cite one I was involved in, but it is an extremely rare edge case, I would say, that in public-facing messaging, like a media statement or a press release if you had to do one, that you were going to say, we paid a ransom. If you think you're going to get dragged in front of Congress, it's probably a good idea to say it to get the gotcha moment out of the way, but leave those edge cases aside. I know that the typical dance in the B2B conversations, particularly for, let's just use my firm, professional services firms that maintain a lot of sensitive data, they're going to want to say it without saying it. Let's say in a phone call, while our investigation is privileged, we can assure you we've taken all available steps to prevent data from being further shared or misused. And I think that's fine because everybody who hears that knows what it means. I think being prepared with that, or honestly, just saying in those controlled environments, yes, we reached a settlement with a threat actor, I think that actually is important if you're going to do it. So I think it's not really relevant or appropriate for what you are telling the world, but what you are telling your, let's say, clients who are worried about their sensitive information becoming public. You need to get comfortable at least strongly alluding to it. And honestly, I don't see a huge difference between saying something that everybody understands means you paid and just saying like, yes, to protect your information, we reached the settlement with the threat actor.
Got it. I see Bruce is on it. Bruce, that should mean we still have a minute for my lightning round question. And I want to ask that, what would you do or what you should do in the next 30 days after this panel? I'll give you my quick answer. You should make sure you have a cyber crisis comms firm on retainer. I like doing it as part of a 3-way. Don't let it just be your generic PR firm. Kelly, Evan, Greg, we'll finish with you. Go ahead, Kelly.
I'd say pull out your comms plan. If you don't have one, then start taking steps to get one. But pull out your comms plan and take a look at it and see, does it make sense for your company today?
Evan.
I'll flip it around because you were nice enough to say what you said, Erez. If I'm talking to a corporate comms team, do you have specialized external cyber counsel, and have you met them? Because corporate comms is going to have to work with that outside counsel if an incident happens, and having it be a completely cold introduction, I find less than ideal. So go find yourself a Greg or Erez and meet them before an incident hits.
And Greg, last word.
Get your incident response team together and practice on a recent near incident.
Love it. Thank you all very much. Bruce, thank you for putting us together for this. Really appreciate it.
That was great.
Thanks,
Erez, very
Thanks,
masterful job moderating. Appreciate it. Evan, Kelly, Greg, terrific. Thank you so much. All right, next panel's up at 11:40 on ransomware remediation. We will be right back.